With the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice. I'd like to welcome you all into this space, into today's conversation. Welcome to the Fight for Fair Maps panel. It's hosted by the Power Coalition for Equity and Justice, Ethnic Media Service, and Spotlight PR to discuss redistricting here in Louisiana and what that means for communities of color and how to get involved. The Power Coalition is a statewide civic engagement table that works to build power in Black and Brown communities across Louisiana. For today, I just want to go over a few housekeeping. This is being translated in several languages, and so I'm going to do my best to speak slowly. I encourage our speakers to do that as well. I'll probably have the toughest time doing that, as you can see. Also, we are streaming this on Facebook Live, and so use the Q&A feature, use the comment box, and our staff will get some of those questions to me, and so that if there's time, we'll have some Q&A at the end. And before I get started, I would be remiss because the Power Coalition does engage in advocacy 365. We have some elections because there's always something to vote for in Louisiana. And so early voting is open, and we have a runoff election on Saturday, December 11th. Please visit powercoalition.org and you can get all your information about the election, as well as redistricting and a myriad of other things. Today, we are joined by some great panelists who are going to bring a diversity of experiences to redistricting. Our first panelist is Representative Royce Duplessis, representative for Louisiana House District 93 in Atlanta. We're also joined by Jacqueline sorry, Jackie, Executive Director of VELA. We're also joined by Denise Ramos, Community Organizer. And we're also joined by Carlos Pollard Jr., Power Coalition Redistricting Fellow. And so what I'm going to do, you all, is just to ask a round robin style of questions based on your relationship with redistricting. We know we've been in this cycle of redistricting. We started off with the census, got pushed back due to COVID. And so now we're in maybe we're a little bit close to the home stretch. It's going to be a long home stretch, but we're close to it. And we've been doing things around the state, and you all bring that diversity of expertise to what we've been doing to really paint a picture of what is happening in redistricting in Louisiana. And so my first question is for Carlos. Carlos, can you explain for us what redistricting is and why it's important?
Yes, well, good morning, everyone. First, I would like to thank everyone for having me on this panel. And redistricting is the process in which governments redraw political districts, and this applies to all levels of government where elections are held. This process only happens every 10 years after the census data is collected and sent back to the states. Redistricting works by the legislative relying on a few components. These components are census data, experts like demographers, and us, public input. To draft maps, we play a critical role in this process, and our voice and testimony is very powerful. There's many reasons why redistricting is important. It's important to recognize that redistricting sets the foundation for the next 10 years. It plays a critical role in who runs for office, who is elected, and how they vote once they're in office, and how they represent our communities. Redistricting is one of the factors in determining who represent you and how they represent you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And that's Carlos with the Power Coalition, one of our 3 fellows that we have across the state, working with community to be able to understand this redistricting process. And so Carlos gave us that high level process of what redistricting is. Representative Duplessis, please talk about what redistricting looks like in Louisiana. We know we've seen you at every road show, that you are a voice in the community that leans towards equity and justice. I think that's C3 friendly. And I just wanted to break it down about what happens in Louisiana and why Louisiana is a unique process, please.
Thank you, Morgan, and thank you to the Power Coalition and everyone who is here on today's call. Redistricting in Louisiana, Carlos really spoke to the importance of it and how it impacts communities. But being on the policymaking side, I'm on the side of really, as they say, making the sausage. And it is a messy process because it is essentially putting a puzzle together, a puzzle that is driven or should be driven by census data, population loss, population gain. But in going beyond simply looking at the numbers have to, or the maps, I should say, have to be drawn in a way that communities of interest are able to pick that they're held together, number one, and that these communities are able to pick candidates of choice. So one of the distinct factors that need to be pointed out is that here we are in 2021, for the first time since the passage of the Voting Rights Act, where Louisiana is not under the same protection of the pre-clearance requirement that we have had in past redistricting sessions. We will be entering a formal redistricting session sometime in early February that will last about 2 or 3 weeks. We are currently, as Morgan pointed out, in the middle of a road show. We're about 50% halfway through. We are going to be on the North Shore of Louisiana in Covington tonight to hear from that community. And the purpose of going on the road show is to promote public engagement, to give legislators who will be drawing the maps an opportunity to hear from communities directly, to give everybody an opportunity to be heard, because we should not be making decisions that are going to impact communities without hearing what's important to those communities. And it's also important that all of this be on the record, the public record, and that this process be as transparent as possible so that the decisions that are made, we can explain and articulate to communities as to why we made certain decisions, on why districts were drawn certain ways, and the impacts that it will have on communities. So that's where we are in the process. Like I said, we're about halfway through, but it is messy. I go back to the messy part of it, because when there's population loss or when there's population gain, maps have to change. It's like the law of physics. And a map being redrawn, and I'm speaking specifically about, let's just say, state house or state senate maps right now, or even our congressional maps. Anytime you change one district, that's going to impact surrounding districts. So there's a domino effect. So there has been population loss in North Louisiana. There's been population gain in Southeast Louisiana. So everyone's district will have to change in the state house and the state senate. We don't know yet what the congressional maps are going to look like, but we do know that the state is made up of 40% people of color, 33% African Americans. We have 6 congressional representatives, but we only have 1 African American representative throughout the state, which equates to only 17% representation at the federal level. So that is a big part of the conversation that we're having now, which is to have equitable and fair maps that are representative of the state of Louisiana.
Thank you. Thank you for that breakdown. And also, if there are things that people want clarity on, as Representative Duplessis really broke it down in terms of where we are and where we want to go and why we are in this moment in terms of the federal protections that have been lost, and what we've been doing to get community involvement. And this is on top of a COVID reality. This is on top of a natural disaster that happened that really pushed this kind of conversation closer to the special session. And really broke down what the opportunities are and what it means for every legislator, but then most importantly, what it means for fair representation. So I appreciate that. And now you can see why I said oftentimes he leans on the side of equity and justice. Now we're going to go to some of our other panelists. Denise, a strong partner with the Power Coalition. I want to talk about the implications of redistricting for communities of color. Oftentimes, we're thinking about this conversation and not thinking about the multiple intersections people might be having when we're having these conversations. And so can you talk about what the implications are of redistricting for communities of color?
Yeah, hey, thank you for inviting me today. My name is Denise Ramos, and I did ask a question previous to us to jump on the live, and I would like to say my point in Spanish, and they will agree to it. So I will start on that, like la distribución de distrito implica la creación y establecimiento de políticas, acciones y planes dirigidos y ejecutados por las poblaciones de color y la minoría, por su participación directa con sujetos de su propio desarrollo en todos los niveles. Eso indica de que nosotros deberíamos de tener una voz en lo que se trata la redistribución de distritos para poder mejorar nuestras situaciones y las situaciones de nuestra comunidad y nuestra gente. El año pasado yo tuve la oportunidad de trabajar con el Census y yo vi las necesidades de nuestras comunidades para poder mejorar nuestra situación en la comunidad con respecto a vivienda, mejores escuelas y poder preparar mucho mejor a nuestros hijos. Y entonces, para mí sería que nosotros tenemos una base y para mí, una deuda con nuestra comunidad y nuestros hijos con respecto a poder votar y ser parte y que se nos tomen en cuenta las ideas y opciones que nosotros podamos tener para mejorar nuestra comunidad como una comunidad. It's a hard counting community, or I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to put both there, on how to better represent ourselves in district or either in government, and making sure we have an equality and that our voice are being heard. Because in order for our legislators to serve us, they need to be preview to our needs and what is it that we want as a communities to better serve us.
Thank you so much, Denise. And thank you for making sure that we understand that representation is important. Not only representation in the way that you look, but the communities of interest, as Representative Duplessis formerly said. Different communities are going to have different interests. And we know that we're not all a monolith, and that we need to be able to have fair representation and people who have that community's lived experience and best interest at heart. Thank you so much. And yes, please put any questions that you might have in the chat, and we will get to them right when I get through each panelist. Okay. Hi, Jackie. Thank you for joining us. How do we get communities who have typically been left behind in this process? And so, Jackie, you've been at the head of an organization that is really talking about communities of color and the multiple representations that we can have, really doing a lot of Black and Brown solidarity and understanding, as well as civic engagement and power building amongst multiple groups. And so we know that the redistricting process is no different, that you employ those same tactics working with this process. And so just talk to me about how we can get communities involved that are typically left out and give us some of those strategies that you employ at the organization that you lead. And please tell us a little bit about it as well.
Yeah, I'd really love for this to be a conversation. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jacqueline Tan. Thanks for trying earlier, Morgan. You know, I think being intentional about our impact by centering cultural humility is essential in training and outreach strategies, period. But we learned from a year-long census campaign that we ran at Vela how messy and the sausage that Royce was talking about, it's very real, right? I think there is a history of exclusion and xenophobia that has happened long before the pandemic, but the data gathered and the relationships being built have been foundational. You know, according to the Pew Research in April 2021, I'm trying to speak slowly, between 2000 and 2019, the Asian American population has nearly doubled, and it's projected to surpass 46 million by 2060. What does that mean for Louisiana and New Orleans? And I say this as somebody who's first generation and a child of refugees, right? Like, my political discourse and the way in which I navigate civic engagement is very different than my elders or than friends that have been here for 3 generations. So I think meaningful representation is essential for our diaspora, with roots to more than 20 countries. You know, go ahead.
I'm so sorry. They asked me to ask you to slow down. My
Okay,
apologies.
I will try and slow down some more. So meaningful representation is essential for our diaspora. We have roots to more than 20 countries in East, Southeast Asia, Indian subcontinent. And here in New Orleans, we've learned through Vietnamese Americans, many survivors of war, refugees, new immigrants, and American-born alike, the power of community and the power of voting for change, and also building power across communities, right? So when we say we're working in solidarity with Black and Brown communities, it's less so, okay, we're showing up because this matters and it's wrong. It's because we are a part of this community. There's this, Grace Lee Boggs has always said, change happens in critical connections, not critical mass. And so we build trust by showing up. And I think a lot of the political apathy that we see as political apathy for Asian Americans is a lack of meaningful, intentional outreach. So what that looks like is translation services that are not optional, but essential, right? This is a part of the praxis of being American. It's a part of building a praxis of being Asian American, right? Being able to engage. And so that's a little bit of what's been going on. You know, we've been really pushing on our end at Vela to connect with the community in ways that are mutual aid centered. How do we bring culturally relevant food, culturally relevant voter engagement information in a way that is not paternalizing and decenters a lot of what is problematic about history that is not so far behind from us? So thanks, Morgan.
No, thank you, Jackie. I love what you said about not making translation optional, but required. That we understand that we want people in our quest towards equity and justice. It really means meeting people where they are. And so that might mean that the road shows might have to change in time. That might mean more virtual options. That means translation is not optional. That means accessibility and folks who are able-bodied versus folks who aren't. And thinking about all of those things. And that's why it's important to have people who think like that, making those kinds of decisions. And so we are mining the questions in the chat. I think I got some help with that. So that's good. So we don't forget any of the questions, and that if we are unable to get the answers to the questions, we will make sure that we write those answers down and disseminate them to you all to hopefully, and we'll be able to get that translated as well. And so the next questions that we have are, what would it look like to you if you were represented in an equitable district? And so that can go to anyone in our panel. So Carlos, Denise, Jackie, Royce, and it could go to any of you. But if your district was an equitable district, what would it look like?
Okie dokie, I'll go. I think I'm going to speak towards the congressional district for the state. And if I were represented in an equitable district, it would have a second majority minority congressional district. The data shows in Louisiana that Louisiana is 3.8% Blacker than in 2010. The racial makeup is 33.1% Black and 62.3% white. So that's almost 40% of the state is people of color. And I think it's time that the districts reflect the numbers that we have.
Okay, thank you so much.
If I could, Morgan, just briefly speak to that, just as someone who's kind of on the other side. I agree with Carlos's point again, but I think that equitable districts doesn't always mean that your representative will always agree with you, or you're always going to agree with your representative. But what it does mean is that you know that your voice matters. It means that you know that you can call or write or connect or reach out to your representative, in that your perspective, your views, your values are taken into consideration, and that they will be part of the equation when decisions are made. And unfortunately, right now, I think poor redistricting and bad redistricting has led to voices not mattering, where you have districts that are monolithic, where elected officials only have to listen to one perspective. And that means that there's an entire perspective in that district that is shut out, and they don't matter. And that leads to disengagement. That leads to people being apathetic and feeling like there's no reason in them even participating, because they know that they feel like their voice doesn't matter. So that when districts are drawn in a way where representatives have to at least consider competing views, I think that is what equity represents, as opposed to communities not even having a voice. But it does not mean that that representative is going to agree or carry out every wish. It just means that they'll have a fair seat at the table.
I really love that. That's so honest and transparent, and I feel like that's exactly what we need. So I can add to that, Morgan, if that's cool. I think for me, representation doesn't simply mean people who look like me. So we can't discuss race without discussing gender and class, right? And I think a lot of times for me in this district, perceived equal representation and competitiveness have an immense ramification on our politics and our communities and the economy and the way people want to set up shop, right, in New Orleans East and beyond. And so I think for me, equity in my district means justice throughout the process and outcomes. How is information being disseminated? Are we connected to our communities regularly? Are we having conversations like this? Are these conversations being translated, and not word for word, but in a culturally competent way where conversations can be had? Because Asian Americans are some of the highest households that live in intergenerational and multi-generational households, right? So how are these conversations being initiated, and how are we incubating leadership in civic engagement for my community? That's what I think about when I think about equity.
Thank you all. Thank you all. And we're definitely getting a lot of questions in on the chat, and I wanted to go to one of them, and it does seem like it's a legislator targeted question, or not seems like it because it has legislator in the question. It's from David Thaddeus Baker. What measures are being taken by legislators to support communities combating gentrification, which is severely impacting historically Black communities and other communities of color? And so maybe not necessarily a redistricting center question, but a redistricting-esque question about combating gentrification in Black communities and communities of color.
Well, I guess that question would fall on me, even though I wasn't named directly. Yeah, I would say that it is connected to redistricting, even if not directly. But those who are elected to represent communities of color, are they sensitive to the needs of what's happening? We see gentrification happening primarily in urban corridors, urban areas like the district that I represent in New Orleans. Um, it's a multitude of factors. There are policies at the local level, there are policies at the state level and the federal level. Um, Tax policy. I could speak to a number of things that we're trying to do to address this problem that is a national problem, but ensuring that ensuring that long-term residents of color who have lived in communities for generations are not pushed out, that the culture is preserved. There are so many different things. I'm personally trying to work with constituents in my community to come up with this, what we call a right to stay policy that will direct the Louisiana Housing Corporation to undergo a study and take a deeper look at recommendations from, be it the Office of Community Development, and how we can create incentives there around giving people the right to stay, or giving them, looking at our tax policy and ensuring that folks are not being pushed out. We just passed a measure just last legislative session that's going to be on the ballot next year that will give voters an opportunity to put a cap on the increase in the property tax rates. And it's a complex equation, but I think that's another piece that we're trying to work on. I also introduced a resolution directing the Louisiana Housing Corporation to do what's called an equity study in terms of how the low-income housing tax credits are being allocated in rural communities versus urban communities, because there is a lot of inequity there in terms of how the tax credits are being allocated for low-income housing developments in cities like New Orleans, Baton Rouge, and Shreveport. And we've seen more of them go to rural communities, but we know that the real issue and the real need in terms of battling issues like gentrification are in your urban communities. So those are just a few pieces. I could go really long. I don't know how much time we have. I could talk about what we're trying to do to address the Claiborne corridor, and we understand how that all plays into the larger conversation around gentrification. But it goes back to it, and just tying into this question of redistricting. It's about having representatives who understand and appreciate the values of the community that they've been elected to represent.
Right. And earlier in the conversation, you broke down that community of interest and understanding the nuances and the gems and the areas of the community, which would be something that you would need if you were from the community, or if you had a relationship with folks in the community that would talk to you about that and you had their best interest at heart. And like he said earlier, we're not going to always agree, but it is the opportunity to have a conversation and for someone to have your best interest at heart. Also, Mr. Sylvain asked if is it possible to have a second majority district, congressional district, without having an adverse effect on the second congressional district? And I know you kind of touched on that, and so did Carlos earlier, that is the hope, but that doesn't mean that other folks' districts are not going to change. And so maybe you can talk a little bit further about that for a moment, about understanding that all districts will have to change for this process to be equitable. And maybe we can break that down a little bit.
Yeah, I'll briefly speak to that. And I think that other members of the panel can probably share additional perspective, but the numbers support an additional minority district. It would probably reduce the minority population slightly in the current second congressional district, but I think it can be done. And I think that gets to the second part of the question of Mr. Sylvain, can it be done without hurting the current district? So there have been 7 iterations provided that of different maps and ways that it can be done. But it won't just impact the 2nd congressional district, but it will also reduce the minority population in the other 4 congressional districts, which one can argue will make the remaining 4 congressional districts even more white, right? In terms of just their population. But to answer the question, I still think that I don't just think, I know that it can be done without causing the type of harm to the current congressional district where it would be compromised in any way. You know, one of the things that we face in the state legislature is that we have districts that are packed with almost 90% African-American vote. And the question then becomes is, if you need 90% of to win, how does that harm the rest of the districts? And we've seen that can lead to even greater harm when you have too many minorities packed into one district.
Thank you. And anyone else that wants to talk about about the perhaps adverse harm that would happen to the existing congressional district? Okay, that is okay. And I want to also talk about what you want people to understand about this redistricting process. And so we have a bunch of reporters on, and we have a lot of local folks like Mr. Sylvain, but we also have people who are representing other places. What do you want them to know about this redistricting process? Maybe some folks can talk about how to get involved. There was a question that said the road shows are 50%. Well, there was a 50% data tidbit that was shared. And I think that was Representative Duplessis that were saying we're halfway done through the road show. So it's not an exact science, no, but we have a couple of more left after January. We'll be into New Orleans. And so that is what he was referring to. And he's nodding his head in agreement. So I think I'm right.
Halfway meaning that we have 10 road shows scheduled and we are now on our 6th. So that's what I meant when I said halfway, because we have 10 scheduled.
Okay, thank you for that. And so what do you want folks to know about this redistricting process? Both the populations in which you work for or serve or work with or represent, but then also what we want people to be able to write in this digital kind of archive, written archive of this process. What would you want them to know? I'm going to start with Denise.
I would like them to know and be aware of the necessity and of the need of the community. Again, I was working with hand in hand with Power Coalition last year during Census, and I was able to be in the field and see the necessity and the needs of our community for better roads, better streets, better education, making sure that our legislators are part of the community and are able to see and do something about the situation that we are facing as a Brown community and Black community. So to me, it will be making sure that they are very intentional about what they're gonna do for our community once the maps are being redone.
Thank you, Denise. And then Jackie, and then also there was another question that came in, Jackie. So definitely what do you want folks to know? But folks have asked, can you talk more about APPI groups in Louisiana? How are they engaged in the redistricting process? And so, yes, Jackie can give you a whole thesis on that. So definitely, what do you want them to know? And then going really into the work that you've been doing. And maybe you can even just walk us through the seed that has been planted and how you've been able to sprout that now. Because I think that it would be helpful for people to understand the strategies that you all have been employing for years, and how you're able to kind of like till that in this process of redistricting. So one thing you want, sorry for that long ass question, but one thing you want them to know, and also how you've been engaging AAPI communities.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I agree with Denise. I think the census process showed us so much. And I think it has to center mutuality. It has to center listening, right? I think what we're talking about when we talk about census and we talk about redistricting, we're talking about belonging and unbelonging. And it's central to what it means to be Asian American. It's central to what it means to be Asian American, specifically in Louisiana, because our percentages, I think we went up to 3 or 4% after the census count. And I question that still personally. But our communities are different because our diaspora is burgeoning and growing. I said a little bit earlier, and I'm going to try and speak a little bit slower, but I'm a child of refugees. And so how I navigate political discourse is different than a third generation Asian American, or friends I have whose parents or grandparents have been interned through the census, right? So their experiences of erasure and exclusion are very different. And I think for our communities in particular, and I'm saying this as somebody who's also a clinically trained social worker, there's an inextricable link between intergenerational trauma and apathy coming off as disengagement. And what we really need isn't moneyballing our communities or hand-holding. It's having really critical conversations like this about what it means to be responsible in reducing harm for our communities, right? And for many communities of color, especially in the Asian American community, whether it's Filipino, Korean, or Chinese, we have both Mandarin speaking and Taiwanese, representation in our community currently. And their voices aren't, I think, amplified or shared even when they're speaking, because the platforms are different. The ways of communicating are different. And so what we're talking about building when we talk about redistricting and outreach for these communities in particular is really about relationship resiliency. What does it mean to hold each other and understand that a win in the Black and Brown community is also a win for the Asian American community, right? What does it look like to fight for translation services that aren't just in Vietnamese, but also in Spanish and vice versa? Right? Like, the goals and the alignment is the same, and how we build that foundation is essential, because that's a part of the design justice process, right? And so much of what Vela has been doing is making sure that our community is heard. When the pandemic first broke out, one of the first things we did was look at the coastal cities and see xenophobic things that were amplified in the media. We knew it was happening here, but we knew nobody was tracking it. So being able to track it and understand needs and understand kind of the evolving displacement of our folks, right? Even through Hurricane Ida, most of the Vietnamese voters that have lived in the East for generations have moved. Why, right? Like, understanding where resources are and knowing that our communities come from literal generations of trauma when they're not American born, right? Largely in part due to American imperialism. So like Morgan said, I could give you a huge host of, a thesis on this, but really working with this particular diaspora that isn't a monolith. We also have South Indians, and we have like Pakistani, community members and young people that we work with. It's so essential to make room for narrative plenitude and have room for our communities to support each other in strengthening our voices. So the Vietnamese American community here has been so strong in leading and voting and community building across cultural, lines and racial lines and generational lines. How do we invite Korean Americans, Chinese Americans, South Indian Americans to join us in conversation and build the AAPI diaspora as a group in the South has been essential in our strategy.
Thank you so much. And I told you all she was going to break it all the way down and really lift up a lot of the things that we've been talking about and that we've heard um, about generational trauma, representation, how representation has been used to sanitize the voice through generations, um, understanding communities are not monoliths. And Carlos, I don't think I came to you. And so I want to know what you want folks to know about this redistricting process. We also got some more questions in from reporters because this panel is so deep with information, but then also action. They're giving you steps to be able to take, to be able to write. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You would think that we would be able to do this pretty easy, but power and progress has never been easy on these lands. And so Carlos, please talk about what you want folks to know. There also was a question about how legislators are working collaboratively with one another towards equity and representation with subsets of districts or multiple districts. I think that's more for Representative Duplessis now that I'm saying it out loud. So how about you just tell me about what you want people to know about this redistricting process?
Yes. So I want to first start off with redistricting is a lot to unpack and it can be extremely intimidating. And I want to encourage and motivate everyone to really take it one step at a time because it's so much and it's so tedious because it's a process that happens every 10 years. And I want to really just kind of go in and talk about how building community helps us build power. We build power by lifting each other up and building community. There's so many organizations that I'm working with, that Power Coalition is working with to fight for equity and justice and fair maps. So I think I want to leave with everyone that redistricting is a lot to unpack, but it's important for us to lean on one another, to support one another, and to think about that generation that's coming after you. I always leave this in any room that I'm standing in talking about redistricting. I'm only 23, so the next redistricting phase, I'll be in my 30s, right? So it's important for me to not only get involved in this process right now, because these maps are going to determine like the next 10 years for my life, but even the people that's coming after me, my little brother who's only 8, or my little cousins that are teenagers, right? So I want to really leave that with everyone, that redistricting is a lot, but if we rely on one another, if we just put the work in, we can get what we want.
Thank you so much. And Carlos, I think that that's an important point. We heard this on the road show, I believe it was in Shreveport, where a young man said that this process will determine if I stay here, me and my friends stay here, or if we leave. I do see some questions for folks to say that they want to get down to the nut and bolts of this process. And so talking about, are you looking at the courts to ultimately resolve or dispute maps, and can the governor veto proposed maps? Who are the key players on the committee? And so I will turn that to Representative Duplessis. I do want to talk though about the governor's power. The governor does have power to be able to veto maps, and lots of organizations have written to the governor to ask that if there are racist maps that are submitted to them, and we understand that Louisiana has never submitted non-racist maps. So if there are racist maps that are submitted to him, that he uses his veto power. Many organizations have written to him to be able to appeal to that. Representative Plessis is on the committee. You know, this panel was curated for you all to be able to understand the process. And so not only did we ask him to be on here because he eloquently speaks about the process, but he also was on the committee and so can answer some of these nut and bolt questions that you all have proposed. So who are the key players on the committee? And I don't know if you can just kind of maybe give us more of an overview of the committee, because the committee has been at every roadshow. And are we going to be looking at the courts to resolve maps? I'm sorry, and I'm talking too fast. So let me just say that a little slower. I got a little excited because this is these questions are interesting to me. Who are the key players on the committee? And are we looking to courts to resolve the maps? And what I said earlier was that the governor does have veto power, and many organizations have written letters to ask the governor to use his veto power if racist maps are submitted to him. So I will turn it over to Representative Duplessis.
So the first part of the question I think I see in the chat was about the final timeline. As I mentioned, we expect to enter into a special redistricting session the first week of February. I don't have an exact date yet, but that should be publicized in short order. I'm pushing for that. We're expecting a 2 to 3 week redistricting session beginning in early February. So that's just from a timeline perspective. Had we not been pushed back by the census, we probably would have done this already. In terms of whether or not the courts are going to be involved, if you look at history, as I mentioned again, we have always had DOJ pre-clearance coverage in past years. We don't have that this time. We do have a governor with veto authority, but I can't speak on his behalf to say what he will or will not veto. He has not made his intentions or desires public or private, to be quite honest. We've had conversations, but I don't know at this point what will or will not be vetoed, because we're talking, there are multiple maps involved in this. There are not just state, House, and Senate maps. We have congressional maps. We have state Supreme Court maps. We have Bessie maps. We have Public Service Commission maps, all of which are going to have to go through the process. So I will tell you that we are proceeding in a fashion as though this will likely end up in court, simply because we just don't know. So you always have to be prepared for that. It's certainly our hope that we can resolve this in a way where we're moving forward and not backwards. And my definition of forward, I think I've laid that out pretty clearly throughout the conversation. But I can't speak on behalf of the governor. And lastly, in terms of who are the key players on the committees, you have your Senate Governmental Affairs Committee chairperson, you have your House Governmental Affairs Committee chairperson. I serve as vice chair on the House and Governmental Affairs Committee. So certainly your chairpersons, your chairmen and women, but I would say more importantly, or it's probably just as important, may not necessarily be the people who are on the committee, but those members in the House in particular, because there's not a veto proof majority in the House. So there's 2 votes shy of a veto proof majority in the House. So there could be 2 or 3 or 4 members in the House who decide that they would be willing to override a veto by the governor. I would say they are key players in this, in this whole process. So we don't know who those people are at this point, but I would say it could boil down to 2 or 3 votes who are not on the committee but are in the larger body, and that's kind of really getting into some of the inside baseball politics of how it all will play out, but that's just the reality of the situation.
Thank you so much. And we are getting to close, and so I know there was a few questions that came in. For the timeline process that the representative was talking about, we do have a timeline on our website, powercoalition.org, under the redistricting tab, more of a high level. And then once the session is called for, we will blast that out to all of our blast it all out to all of our networks, excuse me. And so we have a final question for everyone. What are ongoing measures? And this is more for people who represent organizations. But what are the ongoing measures for organizations to educate people about the importance of the census and the district maps, the 10-year gaps, to ensure, oh, is that the question I was supposed to ask? Oh, yes, it is. I'm sorry. So let me just start over. Basically, what are the measures that you're taking to educate people about what's happening in the redistricting process, tying that into the previous census work that you all did? And so I will go first to Jackie to talk about what you're doing and what you've been doing. And then followed by that, I'll go to Carlos.
So funnily enough, it is having conversations with young folks like Carlos, because this will affect the next 10 years of his life. And one thing I've learned about his generation is whether it's on TikTok, whether it's on, Clubhouse or whatever, they will get into it and they care about these issues. Even, and I think for Asian Americans in particular, young people are often pushed into hard sciences. I hate that term, but harder sciences that don't hurt your feelings, right? And when we talk about AAPI leaders who are interested in civic engagement, social justice, and social work itself, it's a challenging conversation because it's another translation between generations that has to be done. And so much of Vela's work has shifted to focusing on how do we invest in young people like Carlos, and how do we invest in young paid internships where people can get basically, experience with doing this, because it's not just about education and advocacy, it's about investing in young leaders so that they can become representation, that they can understand that they matter. And so much of our strategy is to employ these conversations, but have sustained programming around food policy, reproductive justice, environmental justice, that really can create jobs. Yeah.
Thank you. Carlos?
Yes, thank you, Jacqueline. I would have to echo a lot of what she said as far as my generation goes. I think that having meaningful conversations or continuing meaningful conversations around redistricting is really stressing the importance behind it and exactly what redistricting is. I think it's important to have the redistricting 101 sessions that that my fellows and I do to really explain what redistricting is, to have the coffee chats, to meet community members where they are, to break down different topics of redistricting, which is this Friday, we are having a redistricting coffee chat at 12 p.m. The link is actually on our website if you wanted to register. And we're going to be actually drawing maps and having a question and answer with the fellows. So this will be a very comfortable space for people to just get familiar with drawing maps, building community, and just being comfortable together, right? So I think that that's how we fight for fair maps. That's how we have those meaningful conversations, by meeting the community where they're at and hearing them, and then giving our advice, and then also expressing what we think.
Thank you. Denise? And you said something in this chat that I think is really on point. And that's why we need more of us brown people in the chair so we can be represented. Do you want to expound on that?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I wasn't able to mute myself. Yes, to me, it's like meet our people where they are and making sure we're being vocal. Make sure that normally I'm very active in my church. So, and in my community that I'm a Garifuna American individual. So I make sure that I let them know what is it that we need to do, making sure that they voting, making sure that I am sharing information that is crucial for our redistricting, and making sure, again, that they are they are very visual learners. So normally I will print out paperwork, making sure that I'm telling my community and my pastor, the younger people, again, with TikTok and all the, making sure that they are being very involved on what is it that needs to be done so we can be heard and have those shares that we need as a community, as a Brown community, and as a collective.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Denise. And Representative, maybe you can speak to the road shows and how we are engaging folks in the road shows. I know we did a training last night with ACLU in Covington to make sure that people were prepared to give testimony and to provide their feedback on how they want their communities to look. So maybe you could talk about the upcoming road shows.
Yeah, we're going to 10 different locations. We've already been to 5 throughout the state. Tonight, we will be in Covington to hear from residents in the North Shore, Florida parishes area about what's going on in their areas. And a lot of great points have been made. I just want to reiterate and stress the importance of public participation. And it does seem overwhelming, and it is daunting. And it's easy for folks to feel like, well, why would I come to this meeting? It's performative. They're really just there to check a box to say that they came. That might be the outlook of some, but I will tell you, there's nothing more important than creating a public record and ensuring that your voice is heard at the table. And I can tell you that a lot of the testimony that we hear is very powerful, because for someone to show up at a meeting like this, it shows that they care. And what elected officials need to see is that people care, because once they know that people care and that people are listening, they respond. So, you know, the more people we can have showing up, the more people see that we're being watched. And when folks know that they're being watched, they have a tendency to act accordingly, more of a tendency to act accordingly. So it's just important. And just we have 4 more after this one. We still have Lake Charles, we still have New Orleans, Houma, Thibodaux, and I think we're going to Baton Rouge one more time. Yeah. So that's where we are in the process. But I really appreciate the training that's being done, helping communities understand that making the connection between fair representation, communities of interest, being able to select a candidate of choice, and how that impacts the daily lives of the folks who are living in those communities. So I think that's really the part that I want to emphasize, being able to tell those stories, to make it real, so that people can make the personal connection between something that seems pretty esoteric and out of reach, but it does have a very direct impact on the daily lives of the people who are being represented, and it all begins at redistricting.
Thank
so
you.
Road shows are crucial.
Thank you so much. So you all have heard from a very healthy panel about redistricting, about what we've been doing, what does it mean for Louisiana, where we're moving forward, and really what is at stake. The people, and making sure that their vote and their democracy is protected is really what the name of the game is. And so we will continue with our partners to move towards equity and justice, making sure that everybody has fair representation. The Power Coalition is giving out many grants to organizations across the state for them to be able to engage in education, outreach, and advocacy on the redistricting process. You can get more information on that on our website, powercoalition.org. We also are making sure that our voices serve as an echo chamber in the February session, which is another time for us to be able to engage our legislator, to make sure that we lean on them and ask them to do what they need to do to make sure that everyone is fairly represented. I thank everyone for joining this afternoon or the morning for some of you all. We will be in this process until the end, making sure that all Louisiana is represented. I thank our esteemed panel for taking out their time to be able to share their thoughts, strategy, and their mind. I hope that everyone has a blessed day. And I know we're ending a little early, but I think that's okay. Have a good day, everyone.